Well, foreign direct investment has a very simple rule. Capital goes where it's treated best, and it stays where it's trusted most. This week, we unpack Kearney's newly released 2026 FDI Confidence Index. Well, welcome to the Monocle Banking Podcast, curated by Monocle Solutions. As always, I'm your host, Michael Avery. And for years, the investment story around emerging markets was told in, I think, fairly familiar terms, things like growth and demographics and the demographic dividend and resources and reform. But the world has become a good deal more complicated than that ever since COVID. And today, foreign direct investment isn't just flowing simply to the cheapest jurisdictions or even the fastest growing jurisdictions. Capital is being rerouted, as we see, by geopolitics, by changing supply chains. Industrial policy seems to be back in favor, which is quite interesting. Energy security, as we see the war in the Middle East, bring that really to the fore. And the question is, where can companies find the tech and the talent and the infrastructure and the policy certainty to compete in that more fractured world? And that's what makes Kearney's newly released 2026 FDI Confidence Index so interesting, because it tells a story of investors who are still willing to deploy capital globally, but who are doing so much more selectively. South Africa, of course, sits right in the middle of all of that tension. On the one hand, the macro picture probably less unruly than it has been in some time. Inflation's come back under control. The SARB has held the line, Treasury re-establishing fiscal credibility. And on the other, growth remains weak. Unemployment remains punishingly high. Infrastructure bottlenecks are still a drag on competitiveness. And the country's position in the emerging market rankings has slipped. So the big question isn't whether South Africa has attractions. We clearly do. The question is whether, in a world that's recalibrating at such speed, South Africa still looks like a serious destination for long-term strategic capital. Well, to unpack that, it's a great pleasure to welcome Theo Sibiya, Partner and Managing Director at Kearney Africa, and Terence Toland, Principal at the Global Business Policy Council at Kearney. Chaps, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Terence, maybe let me just start with you in the big headline from the report. Investors obviously still keen to increase FDI, but they're becoming a lot more selective. What in your reading has fundamentally changed in the FDI decision-making framework over the last 3 years?
Thank you, Michael, and it's a pleasure being on the air with you today. Clearly, investors are still investing, but they're far more deliberate about where and why in this more uncertain operating environment. And we see evidence of this throughout our survey this year. Investors tell us that they recognize that the world's being reshaped by geopolitical tensions, expanding industrial policy, as well as accelerating tech competition. But rather than pulling back, we see that investors are adapting to that reality and recalibrating, as we say in the title of the report. So in practical terms, this shows up in a few different ways. The first is that investors are diversifying geographically. We're seeing capital spread across Asia and emerging markets rather than concentrating in just a few handful of markets. They're also managing risk much more actively. We see signs that investors are using tools like scenario planning to navigate tariff disruption. They're actively thinking through their exposure to geopolitical risk. Our results seem to reflect the use of China plus one strategies to diversify supply chains, for example. And investments also increasingly align with government policy. So industrial policy emerges as a key factor for investors and where they decide to make their FDI. Many cite preference for lower tariff environments, for example. So the bottom line is that the capital is still flowing, but it's flowing much more selectively and strategically, especially as investors move to diversify across markets, manage this geopolitical risk, and align with government policy.
And Terry, as you said, scenario planning, because trying to forecast or predict the future in an environment that is unpredictable, or one that is driven by a post on Truth Social from the US president, is a fool's game. But one can scenario plan and try and find where potential weaknesses in one's strategy lie, or potential opportunities. I think one of the most striking findings is that technological and innovation capability has overtaken regulatory efficiency and domestic economic performance as the top driver of FDI. Is that a cyclical shift? Is that driven by the AI boom, or is it a structural reset in how multinational capital is allocated?
A great question. And this was a striking finding for us in the results this year. To us, it reflects that investors are no longer just looking for stability, they're looking for innovation capabilities. So seeing tech and innovation overtake more traditional factors that have normally been at the top of our index for the top reason, the top factors that investors look at, and making their FDI things like regulatory efficiency and economic performance. This does suggest to us this is something of a fundamental shift in how countries are going to have to compete for capital. It's less about just low cost alone, but more about having this future capabilities, things like AI capacity, digital infrastructure, strength of innovation ecosystems more broadly. And we're seeing this play out in other data as well. So investment in AI and digital infrastructure continues to expand, frankly, at an eye-popping rate. We saw the UN earlier this year release data that said that data centers alone attracted more than $270 billion in FDI last year. If we zoom out more broadly, total investment in AI and related infrastructure is projected to surpass $500 billion in 2026. So this is quite remarkable. And in our view, markets that can demonstrate tech leadership and support innovation are going to become magnets for longer term investment. This suggests clear implication that the capital is moving toward places that can sustain this technological edge and go beyond just offering short-term efficiency.
It's so much to unpack in that. I mean, those are just eye-wateringly large numbers. And I guess the jury is still out. Some more cynical and jaundiced than I might look at this and say, might we be looking at one of the most serious capital misallocations in history if some of the potential benefits that are expected from this AI boom don't materialize, but overwhelmingly the market seems to think that it will. So I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. Theo, if we come back, if we apply that lens to South Africa, does the country currently present itself to foreign investors as an innovation platform? Are we still primarily a resource base and maybe a regional gateway into the rest of Africa?
Yeah, Michael, firstly, thanks for having me on your platform. Really a pleasure to be talking to you today. I think this is at the core of answering some of the questions we need to answer as a country around taking advantage of some of the tailwinds which presented them through the misfortune of kind of the situation of the geopolitical front. And I kind of would want to answer that question, Michael, which is a very important question from kind of the broader African context and then zooming into the South African context and understanding, firstly, how investors see us, and then also just kind of how we can respond to what investors are looking for, as shown in the latest survey. So if I start at an African continental perspective, right, I think it's out there, it's public knowledge, and people are talking about this in recent literature that's actually been produced, that, by 2050, one in every person on this earth is going to be from Africa. They're forecasting the population of Africa to be 2.5 billion by 2050, right? Now, what does this actually mean? And I'll bring it back to the discussion around the key drivers. It means we're going to have one of the youngest populations, ever in the history of mankind, being about a quarter of the world's population. In fact, as we sit here now, the median age for the continent as a whole is 19. South Africa's median age is 23. If I contrast that against more developed nations, Japan is 50, Italy's 49, the US is 40. So, I give that context because I think, the source of most innovation is from the younger minds. It doesn't just manifest itself, right? And there are a hell of a lot of things and frameworks and a lot of other enabling, I'll say, environmental things that need to be put in place, systemic change that need to be put in place to take advantage of that so-called youth dividend. And when I look at South Africa, whilst we do have this tailwind of a younger population, there's still quite a lot to do. We do not have the sophisticated technology and innovation ecosystem that will allow that youth to thrive. And that's something that we need to put squarely on the table. We also do still have a situation where most investors see us as a source of resources country. Let's get the ore, let's get it out there, and let's do what we need to do with it. So as it stands now, from our survey, of the 500 executives, South Africa is still seen as a resource and energy complex, if I can call it that. And so we've still got to go back and put in those fundamentals or drive those reforms that we would like to see to give investors assurances that we're making that move towards better aligning ourselves with what they would like to see happening in this country. And I think we're taking steps in the right direction, but we have a lot of work to do, as I point out.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, when you look at that investors cite our natural resources as the strongest reason to invest, it sounds positive. but there is this danger in being seen too narrowly
Correct.
through just a mining and minerals lens. In a world where capital is chasing ecosystems, then, if you look at it, Theo, what could we do if you were advising government today? As we're talking, we've just had the release of a draft AI policy for regulating artificial intelligence. But one would think that we should be trying to position ourselves, at least when it comes to data center capital expenditure, as a very attractive destination for data centers. If you align that maybe with renewable energy, the young population, and being a data center hub into the Southern African region, for example. Yet one doesn't see much in the way of broad policy thinking around that. And I ask that again because industrial policy, and I think that kind of fits squarely within that, is now being seen as central to FDI again.
100%. And one of the things we've picked up is massive increase in terms of policy interventions across all the regions, by the way. So it's not just localized in any particular region. But Michael, what I would say is, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head in terms of all the kind of policy interventions in the areas they need to be making those interventions in a coherent way. Something that we don't see enough of in South Africa. So you'll have the AI strategy, but you don't see how that talks to the talent development strategy, for example, or education, to then make sure that there's that line of sight across all the policies. I think this is one of the weaknesses I think we have, and I would love to see us bring back those kinds of interventions into a more coherent approach. We have tons of plans. You'll be aware. We've got the National Development Plan. We've got the IPAP. We've got this and this, but they don't actually talk to one another. And I think they try to do too much, personally. I think there's a need to actually rationalize and not trying to make everyone happy, but be clear on the 3-4 priorities, let's say 3-4 priorities, and say, these are the 4 priorities that are going to be our top agenda items. And if things don't fall into there, not that they're not important, but we're going to make that trade-off to say, these are the things that we're going to try because we want to attract foreign direct investment. I must say as well, though, it's also worth noting, I think the country has made some positive steps. Michael, if I may say so, we had the FDI index last year. I mean, we've been doing this for 30 years. Last year, South Africa went up to 7th position. I'm sure you've seen that.
Yeah.
And that was coming on the back of, one, the reform agenda, which investors were recognizing and responding positively to. The second one was we got the load shedding challenge under control. Seemingly under control. Let's see. At least now there isn't that energy security question mark that investors were now starting to raise. That seemed to be under control. We had just had a national election, and there was acknowledgement that, with the ruling party losing its outright majority and us going to coalition politics without any major fallout, that our democracy was maturing in a manner that made them feel a little bit more comfortable. And that came across in how we went up the rankings. What I look at in terms of kind of how we've moved now is more not about we doing the wrong things, but I think others have maybe stepped forward a little bit more aggressively on some of the right things, because it's all kind of relative. Yeah. And I think the investor out there is saying, we like the South African story. Let's see some more traction in some of the things that are important for us. We talk about energy, load shedding is under control. Data centers are a huge opportunity. You don't have data center without power. Right. So now the power question has been answered, and they need to get some track record of that. And then let's look and say, hey, there's a massive opportunity in data centers. We've got the renewable energy. We've got people coming. So there's a lot of talk, and let's now look a lot more closely at this market. Mm-hmm. And then is there a possibility of, again, being the major gateway into the rest of the continent?
It's such an important point you raise that, because someone might look at a headline and say, oh, South Africa's dropped from 7th to 12th on the Kearney's Emerging Market Index, where we're going backwards because of own goals or things we're not doing. But it is, I think, again, certainly has got a lot to do with what other countries are doing right versus what we are necessarily maybe doing wrong or too slowly. Correct. These things are not static. Yeah. Other countries move and maybe move more swiftly. We'd like to see, obviously, more urgency with the reforms. But, I guess sometimes that is a question of real politics. Terence, I want to come back to what your report says about industrial policy. Because I think in South Africa, we've debated industrial policy almost ad nauseum through various ministers of trade and industry, from Trade and Industry Minister Rob Davies to Ibrahim Patel, who are very statist, very centrist. They hailed from the South African Communist Party. And now we seem to be loosening up a little bit under Minister Park's towel. But it's interesting that industrial policy is now central to FDI decisions, with 84% of respondents saying it's extremely or very important. So what does good industrial policy look like from an investor's perspective, and where do governments most often get it wrong?
That's right, Michael. This is one of the most striking findings of the survey this year was the degree to which industrial policy has clearly moved firmly to the foreground for investor decision making. What's notable is some of the nuance in the responses. So you correctly noted that 84% said that it's a key factor in where they choose to invest, but they have a strong preference for certain types of industrial policy tools over others. So they point to tools like tax incentives, subsidies, and especially infrastructure investment as very positive factors that help create a more enabling environment for making their FDI. On the other hand, they view more protectionist industrial policy tools like tariffs and export controls far less favorably. There's also a balance here at the macro level. Industrial policies certainly create real opportunities for investors when companies can align with these priorities, but they can also introduce complexity. And nearly 90% of investors said that they see at least moderate risk from competing industrial policies across different markets. And they can see it as increasing uncertainty when these policies are inconsistent or changing on a regular basis. So in our view, what investors are really looking for is clarity and consistency in these policies, and that they'll be more likely to commit capital when this policy is viewed as stable, predictable, and supportive of their investment.
Stable and predictable. Again, that policy certainty is something that whenever I speak to executives, they say, you might sometimes play a game where you don't fully agree with the rules, but you understand what the rules are. And so because you understand what the rules are, you can actually go in and compete and play the game. In South Africa, especially in mining, for example, I feel we've been shifting the goalposts. We haven't given certainty around things like the MPRDA and the mining charter to secure the long-term investment that you need in very capital-intensive, long lead-time industries like mining. It's just one example. And Theo, just to bring you in, I mean, you know, we talk often about localization, reindustrialization, beneficiation of our minerals. Infrastructure-led growth is in every single State of the Nation address. But from the boardroom of a multinational, does South Africa actually have an industrial policy that feels coherent and credible and durable?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I look at what we hear versus what we see on the ground, there's still a big disconnect. So we have a lot of pronouncements on policy and, whether it's localization, beneficiation, et cetera, and we've got massive infrastructure plans. I'm sure you're aware of them. In fact, there's one really exciting one now around the ITP, the rollout of 14,000 kilometers of transmission line. And I think the amount that they're quoting now is about 400 billion rands worth of investment. Now, you have a lot of that talk, but the action then, is not consistent with what investors would like to see. And I think they need to be convinced, right? When they start seeing others, it's kind of like that crowding in effect. When you see others now putting money in, it does tend to attract some of the large investors. Now, we sometimes find conflicting policies. So not only is it not coherent, but almost conflicting in many ways. So we say we want investment, for example, in transmission lines. And so you have big multinationals, whether it be your Siemens or otherwise, saying, hey, we want to be a part of this. And then we say, okay, that's great. You can come, but you need to meet the localization requirement. You need to meet this. And they then say, okay, great. Be happy to set up a factory here. More than happy to do that. But then give us 5 years worth or 10 years worth of orders to justify this investment that we would then be happy to make. And then you get stuck there because the government says, no, we want to bring a lot of different other players and all those kinds of things. So we end up shooting ourselves in the foot with the best of intentions, which is a little bit unfortunate. I think one of the other key levers, Michael, that I think, in a world of uncertainty that we kind of find ourselves in, as South Africa, we've got an opportunity to unlock, I think, more domestic investment. There's a lot of organizations that are sitting on piles of cash, right? And international investors, the first question they ask, by the way, is, why aren't the domestic guys investing?
Yeah.
It's the first question they ask, like, okay, but we see this, but why are they not investing? So if we can unlock some of that domestic investment, and they all look for similar things, by the way, guarantees and surety that, their investments will be protected. They'll be able to do business in the manner that they need to do business. It'll be a fair, level playing ground, all those kinds of things, which I don't think necessarily are there at this point in time. But if we can unlock the domestic, I think it would have a huge impact on the foreign direct investment.
Absolutely.
In our case.
And I mean, and it's only rightly so. A foreign investor would say, well, why are local businesses not investing? Yet you want us to come in and invest. If they don't see an opportunity, they're much more familiar with the market. And so you've got to start at home first and then ask, well, what is it that is stopping local investors from investing. I don't want to get too sidetracked by some of the politics around a particular investment, and that is Starlink trying to get access into the South African market. But I often think sometimes we remain too ideologically hidebound, Theo, to a particular policy. And if you look at human capital development, for example, and you said, what are the ingredients that we need to take advantage of this demographic dividend? Well, education has got to be front and center if we're going to develop our human capital advantage.
100%.
How do we do that? Well, we can improve access to the internet for 2 million school children if Starlink was allowed in the country for free. That is what Elon Musk said he'd do, along with his equity equivalent program offer. And yet we've remained fairly hidebound to local ownership equity rules. So I use it as an example where sometimes you just feel that there isn't that coherence.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very tricky space to pronounce on because there's all sorts of different messages. But I couldn't agree with you more, Michael, but I would present it in a slightly different way. It goes back to a point I made earlier. If you're not clear on your 3 priorities or 4 priorities, then you're going to get locked up in these kinds of debates. If we are clear that education is top priority, right, in unlocking the youth dividend, and we have that coherency, but we have a sense of the priorities, then there's actually no debate, right? So when you have these other things that say, well, it's not achieving this localization requirement, if we're clear what's priority, that falls away. It says, hey, we understand that you'll be able to achieve those outcomes if you do this. Not that you need to do them together in a manner that doesn't, kind of work. But I don't want to criticize them in that, because I think there is a lot of thought that goes into these things. But I just think sometimes we tie ourselves up in complexity that then makes it difficult to make the strides at the rate we could. I think we have immense potential. I couldn't agree with you more that education is one of the key levers. And if you can provide free education, through Starlink and education across all the rural, I mean, that's a massive boon for us. That will change the game completely. And then, I honestly believe then some of the other secondary priorities would actually even benefit as a result. But we don't have that kind of thinking. And I know it's an area that's quite emotive at the moment, but it's again, keep things simple and, be clear on the trade-offs you're making, and everyone, sing off the same hymn sheet.
Trade-offs. And again, when it does come to policy making in the industrial space and potentially supporting industries and not supporting others, they're always going to be trade-offs. But if you are clear about what your goals are, then you can explain and rationalize those trade-offs and get agreement and coherence and keep on moving in the right direction.
Yes, correct.
Now, Terence, the report also notes that nearly, I think it's 9 in 10 investors see at least moderate risk from competing industrial policies across borders. And we see a lot of this because of what's happening in the US and with Donald Trump reintroducing tariff wars. And fortunately, we haven't seen too much of the upping of the ante in the tariff war space. And, the recent Supreme Court ruling going against his tariffs. But how should South African companies and policymakers think about a world where you've got not only the US, but Europe and China, India, Gulf states, all to some extent subsidizing, protecting, directing capital differently?
Yeah, it's a good point, and Theo's point earlier reflects the degree to which this isn't just an issue isolated to one specific country or geography. We've seen this proliferation of industrial policies, especially since the pandemic, really across the board geographically. So this creates a need, I think, to the conversation we're just having, to identify, if you are going to pursue industrial policies, what are those core strategic areas that you want to focus on, be clear about that up front, and execute fully in those areas to be as attractive as possible in those areas.
And from your conversations with investors, how important is things like labor quality versus labor market flexibility? Because we have pockets of very strong skills in South Africa. We also have very deep structural unemployment. So how do foreign investors reconcile that contradiction?
Yeah, so certainly quality of labor market is a top factor that they look to, but they are also looking for flexibility where possible. So it's fallen off from the top of the rankings this year, but I think will continue to be especially important in emerging markets like South Africa.
And coming back to you, Theo, if we look at the macro story, that has certainly improved. lower inflation. I think the SARB has done a great job there of anchoring expectations at 3%, even though
Correct.
I did see Eskom agree to a 7% wage increase over 3 years. I think they may be stuck in a prior regime, but it's stable. We've got a primary budget surplus. Debt is stabilizing. We had the S&P upgrade. Are investors rewarding South Africa for that progress, or do they regard it merely as a necessary but not sufficient condition?
Yeah, my take on that, and I agree with you in terms of all those markers, Michael. My take is that investors will want to see systemic change sustained, right? It's not something we do something and then we expect a result the next week. They're very savvy and they will say, okay, so this is heading in the right direction. Let's give it a bit of time. Let's see if it gains traction, because these are major changes for us, Michael. I'm sure you'll agree. Some of the things that we've pulled up, the reforms, in an environment where you still had, ministers from the Communist Party, and you've had, all sorts of other interests, competing interests in terms of some of the reform. In fact, there's still major resistance as we speak that needs to be worked through to get to where we are. So, but nevertheless, investors will give it a bit of time and they say, these are going to stick. We can see how they're going to stick, right? We see that they've gone beyond the point of no return. And that will give us more confidence that when we are making our bets, because ultimately they are making bets in some respect, it's a competition for their investment, right? They're looking at the whole globe and they're saying, okay, where do I place? And so as they see more of these shifts, inflation under control, I think the other one that they're talking about is the repo rate discussion, which also lends itself to some kind of different environment and having that difference between the repo rate and I think the interest rate. I think they want to try to harmonize that. That'll have a major impact, right? But those things need to actually manifest in then the environment. Let's see how they come together. And then the investors are waiting to see this kind of mosaic of changes leading to an environment that they feel very confident in placing a bet in. And I think it's about holding that line for a little bit of time and seeing how it plays out.
Yeah, that macro stabilization buys you patience, stops the bleeding, I think, while investors wait for that structural reform. So, Theo, if you were advising the government and said, right, pick 3 reforms that would most improve, or handful 2, but focus, what would be those reforms that would most improve FDI credibility over the next 24 months?
So whilst I believe the whole tech and innovation ecosystem opportunity exists, right? I think for us as South Africa, I would pull us back to kind of the fundamentals. And what are the fundamentals? The fundamentals is you got to have power, reliable power. You can't talk about an ecosystem of tech innovation if you don't have power. So you got to get that one. You got to get the infrastructure in place, running water, etc. We can't really even talk about, some of the stuff that the other markets are focusing on until we have those in place. We've got to get services and, the people feeling that the government is working for them, not the other way around. You got to fix your education. Those are kind of the, when the people talk about fourth industrial revolution, for me, it's in those fundamentals, actually, for a country like South Africa. And then everything else can be built on that backbone. Look at the employment issue, right? And say, hey, our big issue, is unemployment, right? Let's just say as an example, unemployment, this education exposure there. And if a minister comes to me as the president and says, hey, I've got this fantastic idea. I'm the Minister of Labor or Minister of communications or whatever. And this is what I'll say, this is fantastic. It looks amazing. But what does it do for our employment? And if there's very little, I said, please, can you go back and just rework that?
Yeah.
Right. And we don't do that. We just say, well, that looks great. Let's carry on. But we're not solving the core problems. And we struggle to make those trade-offs because we don't want to be seen to be unpopular or whatever. But unless we get that right, we're going to be constantly on this, 0.5% growth, 1%, whatever, and we won't be addressing, those fundamental 3 big ticket items that unlock everything else.
I think very well said. Get that right. Find out what that number 1, number 2 priority is. Evaluate every policy, every decision through that lens, and then you can get everyone pulling in the same direction. Much like I think Rasmus did with winning, back-to-back World Cups.
100%.
That was the main thing. When he said to the Springboks, and you watch Chasing the Sun and the great documentaries behind the scenes, it was always that was the main thing, and don't let anything distract from the main thing. Terence, I want to come back to, this may sound like I'm just trying to be provocative or controversial, but it does come up in conversations that I have with very senior leaders of some of the country's largest banks, for example. And the report shows that geopolitical tensions are now the most likely risk identified by investors. It's not surprising, just the way the world is kind of being sorted with the way the White House is being administered at the moment, kind of either for us or against us kind of thing. How does that interact with South Africa's non-alignment or sometimes our ambiguously aligned foreign policy posture? Is neutrality an asset, or does ambiguity create its own risk premium for us?
So in our results this year, it actually points to the opportunities for so-called middle powers that are able to navigate this environment of elevated geopolitical risk. In our view, risks are clearly up generally, but so are opportunities, particularly in new growth markets. And so it's a space where there will be opportunities for more and more emerging markets to attract investors. We saw this in the overall number of emerging markets that were represented in our top 25 this year. We actually went up from 6 last year to 8 this year. And linking back to the previous part of the conversation, I think as long as there's stability and clarity in terms of the policy priorities, markets like South Africa that can navigate some of the broader geopolitical tensions and uncertainties will stand to benefit.
Well, thank you very much. Terry Toland, Principal at the Global Business Policy Council at Kearney, who was joined as well by Theo Sibiya, Partner and Managing Director at Kearney Africa. A rich and timely conversation, and if there's one clear takeaway, it's that the global competition for capital has become even tougher, far more strategic and far less forgiving. And so in that kind of world, we have to redouble our efforts of reform, and we certainly need to see a lot more execution and a lot less rhetoric when it comes to moving the country in the right direction. And well, that's all for this edition of the Monocle Banking Podcast, as always curated by Monocle Solutions. I'm Michael Avery. Until next time, thanks for listening.